Hello and welcome to the Urban Elements Studio. Last year I did quite a few tops for samples on the videos. This was the Petal Power that we did, the Merry Christmas. This is part of a series of 4 different seasonal panels. This was the winter one, this is the spring. This also comes in a smaller size that can be used for a tote bag. But I got a lot of these tops finished last year, but I didn't get any of them quilted. So I'm going to start to rectify that, and we're going to work today with a clear monofilament thread by Superior Thread. So we're going to go ahead and pull the camera in and show you a couple of the things that we're going to use to make this process a little bit easier. Here you can see a little better look at the Petal Power close up. We have a variety of different colors of fabric on here, so as my quilting thread today we're going to be using Superior Thread Monopoly. This says right on the packaging what size needle to use. It's a 90-14 needle, which is the kind of needle I already have loaded on my Bernina Q24. This is just a look at one of the other versions of the Petal Power. This is the spring in dots. This was the Batik version, and this also comes in 2 sizes. You can see these laser cut pre-fused applique kits have all of the fabric already pre-selected. They're already laser cut and they're pre-fused with Steam 2, so the project goes pretty quickly. You could go back and watch the video on the making of this particular panel. A couple of the things that we're going to be using today, I'm going to decide which one of these Urban Elements pantographs I want to use. At first I was thinking I was going to use the holly leaf because we do have holly on this particular quilt, and I also thought about using malachite because this gives a lot of great motion, and I do use this one frequently. But in the end, I think I'm going to use Effervescence because I like the way that the pantograph looks like wind movement. So this has a lot of fun movement in it. It makes me think of the wind blowing or the breeze blowing as the bicycle's pedaling by. I'm not going to pronounce her name because I've never actually heard it. I think it's Hermione Agee, but I don't want to get slain for that. So that's the pantograph I'm going to be using today. And a couple other things that we're going to use are these 2 things. Sharpie magic marker and some children's socks. And I'm going to show you what I'm going to do with these socks in just a second. The Superior Monopoly comes with stretchable netting that fits over top of the spool. The purpose of this is to keep the thread from unspooling in a random fashion as it's on the machine, and to help contain it so it doesn't pop out of the upper thread guides. The thread itself is a little more wiry and less supple than a regular thread, so for that reason that's what the netting was for. But what we have found is that these little jagged edges on the top and bottom of the netting sometimes get caught in the thread as it's unspooling, which causes the netting to get lifted up off of the spool and then gets caught up in the thread guides. So that's why we have these little socks. And this particular pack I got for $7.99 for 10 pairs of socks, and we're only going to use 1 per spool, so that would give you approximately 20 of these to use as spool holders. And the portion that we're going to use on the sock is just this upper portion here. We're going to cut off the heel and the toe. I might keep a little bit of that just to try. You can see I'm just cutting off the bottom. This has no jagged edges at the top, so there isn't anything to get caught on the spool. So basically we're going to just put this on top of the spool like this. and then I can go ahead and cut off this extra portion that I don't need. So basically here you can see what that's going to look like, and then we're just going to pull the thread out through the top, which I will have to feed that up through there. But you can see that this will keep the thread from unwinding in a crazy fashion, and then I'll show you what the next step we're going to do to get to help us get this loaded on the machine. Because the monofilament is so hard to see, what I'm going to do with my permanent Sharpie marker is pin down the monofilament and just go over the clear thread with this black permanent marker. And I'm going to go ahead and let that dry. And as you can see, when I pull this over the clear fabric, the black piece is much easier to see. So I can use that little end there for when I'm loading the machine through the take-up lever or through threading the needle. I have something that I can see a little bit better. So I'm just going to go ahead and let that dry and proceed to threading the machine now. I already have the spool on the spool holder. I have the thread up through the two upper thread guides and through here. One thing that I always do when I'm threading any thread is to hold both ends of the thread to make sure that I'm catching it where it needs to go. This helps get it into the tension discs, but I do have to make sure that my foot is up. So I'm holding the thread back here, which doesn't let the thread slip, and I'm going to go ahead and get that through these additional thread guides. Now I'm to the point where I'm going to start threading through some of these thread guides that have holes in them down to the needle. So I'm going to go ahead and move the camera again and show you how that darkened thread will help get me through the places I need to go. Okay, I trimmed off the edge of the thread so that it was nice and straight, and the black is still on there so I can see a little bit better. I fed it through all of the thread guides except down here to the bottom. And now, because I've got white fabric, I should be able to see a little bit better in getting the thread through the machine. Okay, so we have it through. I also have an automatic thread guide on my machine, but I almost never use that. But highlighting the end of that with the black Sharpie really helped me see to get through the needle. I do have on a size 90 14 needle on my machine, which is the recommended thread that Superior Thread recommends for this spool. Using the Superior Monopoly, it does require that you loosen the upper thread tension. Also, this sock that we've put on here does increase the amount of tension on the spool as well. Now, the standard for my Bernina Q24 is a 4.0 for the upper thread tension. And what I'm going to do is reduce that, and I'm going to start at 1.75. I may adjust this once I do a little test on a scrap piece of fabric on the edge of the batting, but that's where I'm going to start at. So I've really reduced the upper thread tension by less than half, which is a pretty significant reduction. But this is what's required for using this thread because it's a little bit stretchy, and it goes through the machine that way, and so you do need to reduce the upper thread tension. So now the head of the machine is ready. I've got my needle ready. The thread is threaded through the machine, and I'm going to go ahead and get my pantograph ready. As you can see, I have my Pantograph Grids already located on the back of my machine. The positioning of this grids was placed to be in conjunction with the design space in the front of my machine. So the center of the Pantograph Grids is also the center of where I can sew on the front of the machine. So whenever I load a pantograph under the grids, I know that it's perfectly positioned to be in the full design space of the front of the machine. If I had just loaded a pantograph down at the bottom here of the bar, which would seem like the natural thing to do, this bottom 5 inches is not in a sewable space. The bar is in the incorrect place. And if I were too high, again, the belly bar would be in the way. This area here is exactly where the design needs to be to get the full reach of the pantograph. And these pantograph grids come in, I believe, 3 different sizes, and it depends, the size you would buy would be dependent on the size of your design space. The other purposes for the design grids is that they help me mark the bottom and top edges of the quilt when I get to that, but they also do the 2 sides, left and right, so I know when to start and stop sewing the pantograph. Also, there are going to be elements that will go beyond the edge of the quilt, and I can edit on the pantograph grids with the wet erase marker so that I don't sew on and off, which sometimes causes a problem when you're not looking at the quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and get this design loaded on under the grids. And one thing I will say, this particular design is not symmetrical, as many of them are not, and I wanted this curly element to be at the top of the design. I also could have loaded it this way, which would have been fine. It was just a matter of personal preference. So I'm going to go ahead and get this loaded in, and yeah, I think I want this in the back because I want the curl to be back behind the bicycle. So I'm going to flip this over, get it under my pantograph grids, and get the edges marked so you can see how we edit the design on the pantograph. If you can see here where the head of my machine is, where the needle would sew on the edge, my laser light is shining down on my pantograph grids and the pantograph, which is now loaded. I've made this line on my pantograph grids with the wet erase marker, and now I'm going to go ahead and edit the design so that the design does not sew on and off of the quilt, which can sometimes cause a problem if the edge is not properly basted. You also don't want to go too far beyond, because you may have on the edge of the quilt pins or some kind of snapper material to hold the quilt in tension, and you don't ever want to sew over that because you've gone too far. So marking on the pantograph grids protects your pantograph, but also tells you when to start and stop and when you need to edit a design. And so I'm going to show you how I edit that next. For each of these lines, on this one, this really could be sewn out 2 full passes, because I have 2 full designs on here. I can't quite get the third one. But what I'm going to do is edit this design here where it goes off and back on. I'm just going to go ahead and sew that. And then when it goes off here, that'll be the end of it. And I'll do the same thing here. I'll go up over here and then back out. And when I go back out, that's going to be the end of it. So I know these up here are just repeats to help me roll the quilt and get it in proper position. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same on the right hand side, and then I know my start and stop points. Even if I use the left hand side as my start, I know how to proceed to the other end. This is my edit for the on the back. It's the right side. So as I come up, rather than going off and back on, I'm just going to tighten up this curve a little bit and go off, and that'll be my end point. Same here, off and end point. So I know that when I sew off, I'm not going to run over pins or any other basting hard material that's holding the quilt in tension, which would totally knock your timing out if you happen to do that, aside from breaking the rulers. So that's why I like to use the Pantograph Grids for marking. You also can do the top edge and the bottom edge, which I will do after I get the quilt in position. I have my quilt positioned so the top edge is would be represented right here on this line. So I've gone ahead and edited my lower echo, which I'm actually going to sew out to get this started, and then I'm going to be able to get 4 passes, the half pass and then these 3, before I roll up on this particular panto. But as you can see, I've X'd out some components of the design because I've edited these out. Just a matter of personal preference for how this loads at the top. So I've curved the design over, edited it here to continue on, but these lower portions that are so close to the top, I'm not worried about because I'm going to have some trimming and the binding on the quilt. So I'm not worried about that little bit of space. But this allows me to edit the design at both the top and bottom of the quilt when I get to it, and the 2 sides on the panto, so that I'm not sewing on and off the quilt, running into pins, red snappers, or anything else that you've used to get the quilt loaded onto the frame. So that's the back of the machine is set up now. I'm going to go ahead and move the camera to the front again and just do a little test drive on a portion of the excess batting and check my tension. I changed my bobbin thread to an isocord, which is what I commonly use anyway, so I know that the bobbin tension is good because I've already adjusted the bobbin for that type of thread. Any adjustment that needs to be made will be made at the top. I did some little test sewing here on the side with just a strip of fabric that I 505 to the batting, and now I feel like I'm pretty happy with the way that the tension is, and I've started to baste the edge of the quilt. I'm going to go ahead and finish basting the sides and top, and then I'm going to sew my first row out. My machine is loaded with the thread. I have the needle changed. I have the monofilament thread has basted the edge of the quilt so that the edge can't lift up. That way the foot can't get caught underneath the edge of the fabric in any way, which would cause me to have to cut it out of the hopping foot. So the edge is basted. I have the thread pulled up here at my start point for the back where the laser light is at. So I have the needle down and I'm ready to start my first line of sewing. One thing that I will tell you is when you're using monofilament, you have to sew quite a bit slower than you would if you were using a standard thread. But the benefit of using the monofilament, because it's clear, it will blend perfectly over the entire quilt, and you won't be able to see any color changes as it goes over the different colors of fabric. From this vantage point, you can see where my start position is here and where I've dropped my needle here, that they coincide. I've gone ahead and pulled up my bobbin thread again, and I've taken some extra stitches from the front here just to make sure that I've locked the monofilament in, because it's really wiry and it could pop out. This particular panto, including that half pass that I did at the very top, I will be able to do 3 passes before I roll it up because of the size of the design. So I have 2 more passes to go before I need to roll the quilt. The next pass I'm going to show you is from the back, so you can see how I'm following my edit points. You can see this was my first half pass, which we finished. This is my second pass, and I have the thread lined up and ready to go, and that'll be my third and final pass. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on that, and you can see how I follow at the beginning, and maybe you can see at the end also how I do my edit points. You can see here I'm following how my green lines go on the Pantograph Grids rather than the original Panto. And then for the main body, I can just go ahead and follow the actual design. When I get to the end, then also I will follow the edit marks that I made on the Pantograph Grids at that side. I know it would be tempting to sew a lot faster, but we don't want to cause that monofilament to stretch out and snap while we're sewing. We want to give it time to feed evenly through the tension disc of the machine. To the end here, to the last section of the design. I can see my line on the Pantograph Grids telling me that the edge of the quilt is coming up. And here's my first edit. And here I'm going to go off of the quilt. And I have my needle down so it doesn't roll in any way. And I'm going to go ahead and cut my threads, move to the other edge, sew my final one. I'm not going to show you that because you've seen it from the front and the back now. After I sew the final one, I'll show you how I roll the quilt to make sure that the lines are perfectly lined up for the next row. As you can see, this design is really deeply embedded into each row, so proper placement will be really key for this design. At this point, I've sewn a half pass and 2 full passes. These are all that are available on the Panto. I have the Echo at the very top for doing the finishing of the quilt, but I need to roll the quilt at this point, so I'm going to go ahead and drop my needle at the edge of the design here that's closest to me. I want to drop the needle right in the design so I know exactly where I need to roll the quilt up to. I'm going to leave the needle in. I'm going to unlock the 2 bars that hold the quilt in tension so that I could roll it up. As I roll the quilt with the needle in the quilt, the laser light in the back is going to scroll down, and I'm going to show you in the back how we know where to place or to stop rolling. So I'm going to leave the needle down, unlock the 2 bars, and I'm going to move the camera so you can see the laser light, how we're moving it to find our location. My needle position is dropped in the very top of the design here, and this is an echo quilt, an echo pattern. So what I want to do is bring this laser light down until I get exactly to the same part of the design where the echo is, or where the last repeat was. So this Panto is going to let me sew these two designs out, these two rows out each time, and then I'm going to roll the quilt, and so this is where I'm going to visually mark. So I'm just going to go ahead and roll the quilt up and hope that it doesn't hit my camera. And right here where I get to that point, that's where I'm going to go ahead and lock the bars back in place, and I can go ahead and start quilting again after I get to the edge of the start position. But now I know I've rolled the quilt up exactly where it needs to go, so the design interlocks perfectly. I've gone ahead and tightened the top bar up, the take-up lever, and the bottom bar. And I've done it equally, some at the top, some at the bottom, to make sure that my dot maintains at the design where I need it to repeat. If I'd only done tightening at the bottom, I might have pulled this up to here and then it would have overlapped the design. So I want to do it in equal proportions, top and bottom, to make sure that I keep my dot right on the design where it needs to be. Now this is not the design we're going to sew because that's what we've already sewn. That's where we've moved our pattern. So I'm going to go back to my start position here, which should give me a perfect alignment. I'm not going to show you the entire pass on here. I just want to show you a portion here. This is going to be the first row after we've lined up or we've rolled the quilt. So I just want to show you how the placement will go here. And then once we get past this part, I'll go ahead and edit that out so you don't have to watch the whole pass. But I just want to show you how the alignment worked as we sew that out. I'm to the end of my quilt. I have one full row left to sew. I also have a little bit of the echo. This green line here that I've drawn on top of the Pantograph Grids indicates where the bottom of my quilt is. So you can see I'm not going to be able to sew these pieces here. So I'm just going to continue right bypass that whole piece. And that's going to be the case on every single one of these. So I'm going to go ahead and edit that on my Pantograph Grids to remind me not to sew off of the quilt. So we have this quilt pulled off the frame. It really only took a couple hours to get it all loaded and quilted, even with doing the video. Also, because of the size of the pantograph that I used, which was Effervescence, I only really had to roll the quilt, I think, 3 times. It may have only been twice. But you can see that the quilting with the monofilament doesn't really stand out too much, but it does certainly give the quilt texture and movement. Perhaps you can see a little bit more from the back. Maybe I'll do a close-up before we finish. But a couple of the other things that I wanted to mention. We did feature the Pantograph Grids also today, showing you how to edit your pantograph design. And I want to point out that we did use the dry erase markers. The benefit over the dry erase, which is more like what they would use with the overhead projector, is that the inking will not brush off. So when you're unloading your quilt or loading your quilt, if it happened to have brushed up against the Pantograph Grids with the dry erase marker, some of the ink might have gotten onto your quilt, which is not ideal. So with the dry erase marker, it can't just brush off. You have to actually wet it first to wipe it off, which you can do with water or Windex. It makes the ink a little harder to get off by accident by rubbing it onto your clothes or onto your quilt, which you wouldn't want. So that is this project finished, and I want to thank you for joining us today at Urban Elements, and I hope you enjoyed the video.